Hey, this is Judah Mantel from SceneForge Studio, and this video is going to go over a new version that has an early alpha feature that is available and ready for you to use, but it is a little buggy, and quite frankly, I wanted to just release it because it's really cool. And that is the VFX editor that I showed off in the last video. So previously it was very much experimental, and it still is largely, but it is now available to use. So let's jump right in and showing off the way this works. So you can go to Create over here, Dynamics, VFX element, and this works just like any other object, except you can see here we have a particle system. And I can click, I'll move this up a little bit, and you can see we have our particle system here. You can toggle the playback with the toggle over here. And to edit what's actually going on, you can open up this editor button. But before we do that, I want to just show, as you can see, we have this little orb here with the flame icon. This is what allows us in the editor to actually see this effect and click on it. As you can see here, the final virtual cameras, despite being able to see the effect totally fine, if I can even find it, it will not see that little orb. That's just for us as the designers to be able to easily select it. So I'm going to open up the particle system editor by selecting it, going to properties, and opening up the VFX editor. Now you can see here this is very much alpha. It is a little buggy, but it is totally usable in its current state. So I'm going to close this and open this up nearby. And basically this is a node-based editor. So as opposed to just a list of toggles and stuff, kind of like the visual settings, this allows us to have much more customizability in terms of what we're actually looking at when we're editing our system. You can also zoom in and out with the scroll wheel and pan with the middle mouse or right mouse button anywhere like that. So this is our main node, our VFX element master node, and you can click and drag to move this around. And this is where we're actually going to slot in. You see we have these sockets here, different modules relating to different bits of information that the VFX element can use to display the particle system. You can see we have a couple options here that are just overall global options, such as the lifetime and the spawn rate, and the rest are more specific options relating to different categories. Now to add other nodes, you can just right-click somewhere on this graph, or press the tab button to open up the node menu, and that will appear anywhere you put your mouse cursor. So there's different categories. There's core, which are modules that slot into these purple slots. And there's math, which is for operational stuff, values and stuff like that. Graphics relating to color and texture. And then volumes, which is how we're going to indicate the actual volume of the particle system emitter. So I'm going to start by changing this emitter, the actual volume of the effect, from being this cone that you see here to being a box. So when you select it, it appears here. You can click and drag or right click to either duplicate, clear, or delete it. And of course nothing changes, because in order to do that we have to click and drag this little output socket and slot it into the volume input. And you can see now our emitter is now a box. And you can see we have the box size of 1 by 1 by 1, but this is not directly editable. To do that, to actually set this, we can add another node, math vector 3, because it's 3 different values on the x, y, and z. And you can set this to, let's say, 1, 2, 3, and slot that in there. And you'll see now we have our box changes in volume. And just like that. So that's kind of a brief overview of the way this works. It's a matter of controlling the flow of data from, let's say, a value to a property reader, so to speak, and then into the master node, which is what controls the actual system. So there's other types of volumes, such as a sphere, which has a input for a radius, and a cone, which has an input for a angle. Now, if you want to stop this video here and just go around experimenting with these different nodes, by all means you can do so now that you know the way it works roughly. But from now on in this video, I'm going to actually go over each node and the way it actually interacts with the particle system. In the documentation, there will be a full write-up of the way everything works and what each node does, but if you're a more visual learner, this video is for you. Now, it's worth noting that this is a very flexible system in SceneForge, and it might be used for other things, not just particle system editing, such as live compositing with chroma key, or even some logic for animations. Now let's adjust the lifetime and the spawn rate. So these take in just values, so we can go to math, value, and bring in, let's say the lifetime would be 1. So now it only lasts, each particle only lasts 1 second. And the spawn rate is how many particles spawn per second. You can actually double dip here and use the same thing. So now one new particle will go every second, or you can add a new node for specific properties like this. So you can adjust things like that. Now, if you wanted to use these values to kind of have different properties correlate to each other, you can use math nodes, math operations, to slot in different values that will interact with each other. So let's say we have these two values being multiplied, and you can put this anywhere you want. So now the spawn rate is the lifetime times 10, and you can change the property like this. And it's kind of a matter of just controlling the types of properties and the way you want this information to go through. So this is the lifetime and spawn rate. And of course you can take these values and plug them into the random range like this. So now you have 2, and you can change this one. You know, go pretty crazy with it. I'm obviously not going to do that. I'm going to just bring this back here. Now let's talk about some of the other modules. So I'm going to move this over to this side so it's out of the way. And let's go to our motion module. So we're going to go to add node core motion. And you can see we have the speed, size, and rotation, which is kind of the standard transform values. You can see we have the position, rotation, and scale. And we can slot this in right here. Now this is also a simple float value, a regular value, and you can slot them in as you want. So if I say a speed of 0 means that they just kind of spawn and stay here. And we can add a size. And rotation, because this is a circle, it doesn't really look, you're not going to notice that much of a rotation difference, but you can slot that in here. We have motion, we have volume, and next we have visuals. Now this is the fun part. We're going to go to core visuals, and you can see we have a larger node here. Bring this over here. And we have our particle texture, color, length scale, and you can choose whether or not this is a lit material, meaning it responds to lighting in the scene. Because you can see here, even though the lighting is very dark, these particles are self-illuminating, which in some cases is not what you want. So you can just turn this on, and you'll see now they're still there, they're just harder to see because it is very dark out. And you can see them reacting to the scene lighting like that. So length scale is very simple. It's just a value that is the scale of the height, essentially. So 0 is completely flat, 1 is standard, and you can increase this to 2 or 10 to make really long particles. So for rain or things like that, you can kind of just stretch them out. Next, we have the particle color. So this is cool. Go to add node, graphics, and I'm going to bring in a color node as well as a gradient node. Now you can slot in a color node, and that will just allow you to open the color picker and change the color as you want. Or you can type in a hex value. And this stays the color throughout the entire lifetime of the particle. But let's say you want something a little more interesting. Maybe you want it to fade in and out, because you can see when they die, they kind of just disappear. We can use a gradient. So I'm going to remove this connection and slot this gradient into here. Now to edit this gradient, we can click on it, and we have this nice gradient editor. So on top, we have our alpha value, our transparency, and on the bottom, we have our color. And you can click and drag these little keyframes to change the position, and click anywhere on either side to add a new one, and right-click to remove. So I'm going to say, at the start, it's going to be invisible, then the end is going to be invisible. So you see if I click done, it's completely invisible now. So what we can do is add a keyframe over here, and increase the alpha, and then another one over here, and increase the alpha. So you can see it will fade in, become solid, and then fade out. So you can see the way it looks a lot better now. And you can do the same thing for colors. At the bottom, I can make this, let's say we'll just go crazy here, a nice green. Then it's going to transform into a purple. And then at the end, it's going to be a solid red. And you can see the way these colors change in the preview. And when you click done, you can see the colors reflecting itself over here. And that's pretty cool and pretty fun. Now let's talk about texture. This is also really cool. Let's go to add node, graphics, texture. This is a big node. We can bring this in here, but we can click select texture file, and that will open up your project window. And we can actually select a file. I'm going to go to my downloads and select this file right here. Now you can see if I zoom in, this is a texture that has a bunch of different little sections. It's a grid. And you can see we have our texture is now that image that we set. But obviously we don't really want it to look like this grid, because this grid is what's called a sprite sheet. And you can find them online, or you can make them yourself. It's basically a matter of selecting different animation frames and distributing them evenly throughout the image. And that's what the flipbook setup is. So if you had a single particle, you can leave it as is. You'll see your nice particle, and there, you're done. But we want this to animate. So we're going to go to Add Node, Graphics, Flipbook. Slot this in here. And you can see we can set a grid size. So it's 6 by 6. And you can see now it'll only show 1 because it's only using a single frame at a time. And you can change the frame rate. Let's make this 24. You can see now over the course of the lifetime of the effect, or at 24 frames a second, it'll shuffle through these individual frames and animate the effect. Now this is not a great example because controlling the color is not really helping because the color is already baked into the texture. But if you were to make your own particle effect, I would suggest making it a solid white shape, essentially, over and over again, and then use the color nodes to customize the way it looks. Next we have forces. This is also pretty cool. Core and forces. This is very basic. It's just the gravity multiplier and the effect velocity. So right now you'll see this is just moving by the speed that we set in the motion, which by default is 1. You can see now they're going much faster. Now you'll see here when I change this, if I disconnect this, it waits for all the particles to die out before it creates the new ones. But let's say you wanted this change to happen instantly, you can just turn on this auto refresh up here. And you'll see with every change we make, it'll automatically start it from the beginning, which might be easier or more annoying depending on what you're working with. So the forces over here is as follows. I'm going to make the speed 0. So they just spawn and they don't go anywhere. I'll also make the size 2 so they're a little bit easier to see. Now the gravity multiplier is the effect of gravity. By default it is 0, so it's not doing anything. But if I were to make a value of 1 and I slot this into here, you'll see when the particles spawn, they'll respond to gravity. So this is useful if you have if you're using a box volume and you want to create it like snow or something like that. So you can see we have this like roof here. We can position this over something. And if we increase the spawn rate, we have some snow because it's responding to gravity. And you can change this to be whatever you want. Make this a little slower. Or even cooler, to make it a more realistic rain or snow effect, you can go to range and create a random range between 0.5 and 1.2, let's say. I find that's a good range for gravity. And you can see now we have a nice variation of the falling gravity. And the velocity is essentially the direction that the force will go in. So not necessarily gravity, but just an influence in a certain direction. So we can go to Add Node. This is a vector 3 because we have the x, y, and z. And if I were to make this, let's say, 2 on the x, you'll see now they're influenced to move more towards the local x-axis of the object. Or you can make this 100. So now they're shooting really fast in this direction. So it's an alternative to using the speed effect. It's kind of like a multiplier for specific directions, to put it simply. Those are the element forces. I'm going to delete this again just to kind of clean things up. So we did motion, volume, visuals, forces, then we have noise and lighting. And this is really great. This is kind of where your particles can really become more and more realistic, I suppose, or just add some interesting variation to them. And right now we just have a straight shot of just particles appearing upwards. And you can see they're spawning from random positions within the bounds of our volume. But let's add some variation so it's not so robotic. It looks a little more natural. So we can go to our Add Node, Core, Noise, and this is the element noise node. So we can slot this in here. By default, it won't do anything, but let's get some values and let's go to, okay. So let's add in a frequency and strength. So this is for noise that actually gets generated, and you can see the texture here. If I make a frequency of 1, you can see it kind of changing. If I make this 10, you can see the way the noise reacts. I want to link a video in the description that goes over this stuff a little more concisely than I can do in this video, but essentially it allows you to add random variation to the movement in a way that feels very natural. And the strength, I'm going to make this 1 for now. Now you can see nothing's happening. That's because we did not set an influence, and the influence is essentially how intense the effect will be on the position, rotation, and or scale. And this is indicated by a vector 3. And so this vector 3 normally doesn't get used for this, but it essentially means x is correlating to position, Y is rotation, and Z is scale. Now, because these are circles, the rotation is not going to make much of a difference, but if I slot this in here, and I say 1 on the position, see now the position gets influenced by our noise pretty significantly. I can even make this 10, so it gets even pretty crazier. I'm going to make this 1, and I'll make the scale also 1. So you can see here, the randomness gets affected on the scale. Make this 0.1, so it's a little less intense. Now the intensity and the amount of jitteriness is all set by the strength and the frequency. So if I make this 10, you'll see because the particle or the noise texture is much more dense with spots, to put it really simply, they're much more jittery. If I were to make this 1, you can see it's a lot more flowy because the black and white areas are a lot smoother within this little texture space here. And lastly, we have the lighting node. So I'm going to add a lighting node, or it's called illumination over here, and bring this over here. So this allows you to set the color, intensity, and light ratio. Now this color and intensity is independent from whatever color you set in the visuals node. And that's because it's the emission, color, and intensity of the material itself. And what that means is, if you've ever seen, let's say, a neon sign, the material itself will emit light. And that kind of gives the effect of that with each particle. So I'm going to add a color node, slot this into here. I'm going to make this a nice blue. And you'll see nothing happens because we have to set the intensity. So let's go to math. This is a value. I'm just going to make this 1. And you can see here now we have a nice blue color. Now emissive materials are directly affect bloom. So if you go to your visual settings in your post-processing and you increase your bloom here, you can see kind of like the light bulb or the emitter of a light, it'll have an impact on that. You can make this something like 10 for a really bright effect. It all depends on what you're going for. Now this is just the material look, kind of, so it doesn't really have an actual impact on the scene, as you can see here. But what we can also do is add a light ratio, which by default is 0. But if we set this to, let's say, 1, so this is a range between 0 and 1, so if you were to make it, let's say, 1, which is 100%, that means that every single particle will emit a color, or emit a light, that is the color of the particle, with the intensity and range relative to the alpha value of the particle and the size of the particle. So this light ratio actually does not have to do with these two things. It has to do with the color you set in visual settings. So I'm going to set this to 0 for now. I'm going to really quickly add a visuals node again, so you can see they change over time. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to make this a lit material, so it's hard to see in the dark. But if I go up here, I make this 1, you'll see now that 100% of the particles emit a light. And you can see it dancing around. So for fire effects and things, it is pretty cool. And this will change based on the color. So if I switch the blue and the red, you can see now the light is a lot bluer. And being added to this is going to be some control over the intensity and the range, kind of like a multiplier or a modifier. But you can see here, this all put together, you can create some really interesting effects, whether that be fire or explosions or other types of things. And as development continues and as the system gets more and more powerful, more and more types of nodes will be added. But until then, it is still in alpha, so there are some quirks that I'm sure you'll discover. And once those things kind of iron themselves out, and as this system improves, more videos and documentation will be made about them. So again, this is available now in the latest release. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to see what you create. I will see you in the next video.